Hey everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on MasterClass CX. This is our second episode, and guess what? We have Annette Franz, a thought leader in the space of customer experience. Annette is the CEO and founder at CX Journey, a global consulting firm in customer experience. She's also authored two books. The first one was Customer Understanding, and the second one is Built to Win. Annette also celebrates 30 years of being a customer experience professional this year. And that's not it. Annette was also named as one of the most influential tech women on Twitter by Business Insider. Annette, it's absolutely amazing to have you on our second episode. And just for our viewers, could you tell them as to how you got into customer experience and how you've really stayed there for the last 30 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having me on. This is actually my 30th year in this profession. I started back in 1992 at JD Power and Associates. Saw an ad in the newspaper for a market researcher, and I love doing math and I love writing, so it was a great combination of skills that I could bring to the table. So yeah, but over the last 30 years, I've been on the vendor slash consulting side, running consulting services organizations, and then also had three stints on the client side working on CX strategy on the client side. And about 5.5 years ago, I jumped out of all of that and started my own consulting firm. So I'm coaching and consulting clients on really soup to nuts customer experience strategy. So and having a good time doing it. So
Excellent, good. Thank you so much, Annette. I think we'll just dive into the meat of it then,
okay.
right? In terms of customer journey mapping. So, very simplistically, what is customer journey mapping?
Yeah, in its simplest terms, it really is just a visualization of the steps that customers take when they interact with a brand from some point A to point B, right? And it's really what we're looking at is what the customer is doing, thinking, and feeling as they're completing that interaction or that transaction and achieving the goals that they're trying to achieve in whatever they're trying to do.
Right. And if you kind of just think about this one, are there any prerequisites before we get into the process of journey mapping really? So is it that we need to kind of segment customers prior to actually getting into journey mapping?
So before we get into journey mapping, we don't want to segment customers. We actually want to look at customer personas because every personas are much more insightful and more descriptive of who the customer is and what their needs and pain points and problems to solve. Segments are so high level, so we don't really want to start with segments, but we start with the personas because different personas have different needs, right? So, for example, I always go back to a workshop that I did in Australia 5 years ago where we mapped out the car buying experience. And there were a couple of different examples. There was, the father who wanted a truck to transport all his toys, his boat, his, wave runner, his trailer, whatever it was, right? And then there was the mother and father who had a first time driver in the family and they were coming in to buy a car and, very different needs from obviously the gentleman buying a truck. And so we need to take a look at who the individual is that's going through the interaction or that persona and really start from there when we do the journey mapping is at the persona level.
Right. And typically, who would we need in the room then to actually, journey map? I mean, clearly there are multiple stakeholders that we have. So, who
Yeah.
would you think are the most appropriate folks to kind of be in the room?
The most important folks are your customers. We absolutely need to have customers in the room. If we do it without customers, then we're creating what we call assumptive maps. And a lot of times that's as far as some people get, right? They do the assumptive maps and then they don't go out and validate with customers. So we start with customers in the room telling us what they're doing, thinking, and feeling. And then stakeholders, depending on what interaction or what transaction we're mapping or what journey we're mapping, that could vary, but I like to use the example of a customer service interaction, right? We want more than just the customer service folks observing. We want someone from marketing, from sales, from product, from accounting, from product marketing, because it's good for them to hear what the customer is going through. Because if we can hold off and we can solve those issues further upstream, then once the customer gets the product and is doing what they're doing, they won't have the issue, right? So I always say, marketing's messaging was off, sales sold the dream, the product was faulty, product marketing didn't, documentation was incomplete, accounting had a invoice that was inaccurate or hard to read or hard to understand. And so if we can have those folks listening in on what the customer is experiencing and have them take that away and go back and fix it, the amount of issues and the amount of contact, amount of customers contacting the contact center is certainly going to diminish if we can solve those problems in advance.
Okay, and typically, in how many sessions would you recommend that this we kind of go through this exercise?
Yeah. So it depends on how you set up your workshops, right? The workshops can be set up in a couple of different ways where you've got customers from different representing the different personas in the room, and you've got different walls in the room where each persona is doing their mapping work. Typically, we'll do let's say you have three personas. Typically, we'll do three workshops, one for each of those personas, and for a specific journey that we're mapping, right? The number of workshops you could do is pretty much endless because you've got endless journeys and you've got, multiply that by the number of personas you have. So journey mapping is an ongoing thing, first of all, because there are a lot of different journeys you're going to map. And second of all, you're going to update those maps whenever the experience changes, right? So you want to keep those maps current.
Yeah, I think that's a important point. I mean, it can't be a one-time exercise, isn't it? Those maps have to tweak and change and adapt as these experiences change.
Yep.
Yeah. And how often do you typically say those maps need to be refreshed? And because I think organizations struggle to kind of, obviously get everyone in the room all at the same time. But how often would you kind of recommend that?
So I would refresh the maps anytime that the experience changes. Anytime the experience changes, anytime something changes about the business, right? So if there are new products, there's an acquisition, there's a change in something, there's a change in customers, right? So you've got, because customers evolve and their needs evolve. So anytime there's that type of a change that ultimately impacts the experience, or you make some change to that process that the customer goes through, you should refresh the maps. Absolutely.
And clearly, I think you've been multiple workshops. Some probably have worked out quite well. Some might not have been. So, what are those areas that folks need to avoid? When actually going through the exercise of journey mapping.
Yeah. So we talked earlier about stakeholders. One of the things that we need to make sure is that the stakeholders aren't the ones doing the mapping. They're observing, right? And they can ask questions at the end of the workshop. So we've got to have customers in the room. We've got to start with those personas. The customers have to represent those personas. I see clients sometimes challenged to make that happen. I think that one of the big things that we have to think about is, why are you journey mapping, and do you have the budget and the commitment from your executives to make changes with what you learn? I think that's probably the biggest thing that we need to address before we even start doing this work. And I've actually talked people out of doing journey mapping until they have that in place, right? Because otherwise you're just wasting people's time. You're wasting people's time, you're wasting money. And so those are some of the big challenges. I think we need to bring data into the maps. People often don't bring data in the maps, and then that's a really key part of it. And they don't look at the maps as a process, right? I look at it as a process. We have to capture the current state of the journey. We have to capture a current state service blueprint, which is what's happening behind the scenes, people, tools, systems, processes that support, facilitate, and create the experience that the customer is having. And then we need to future state, right? We need future state, ideate the future state experience, create that future state service blueprint, and implement that. So I look at it as a whole process, whereas a lot of people just look at as this one-time picture on the wall, kind of thing, which really isn't a catalyst for change at all.
And how have you kind of seen this change? I mean, post-pandemic, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, first of all, I would say that during the pandemic, during the heart of it, back in March, the first several months of it in 2020, we saw a lot of companies pull back and say, okay, well, we're letting our CX team go, or we're repurposing you, or whatever. And I think very quickly they realized, oh no, we need to understand what our customers are doing and why they're hoarding toilet paper and all of this stuff, So a lot of my friends in the industry very quickly got rehired, got repurposed back to what they should be doing, and looking at the customer and customer insights and customer understanding. And so So I think that was a big thing that happened. I'm seeing that, like with journey mapping, obviously we're doing a lot more virtual workshops rather than in person, which is actually a good thing because it opens us up to bringing different customers and different customer types. It's a lot more accessible, right? Because you're not, it's more cost effective because you're not bringing flying people in and hotel and all the travel expenses. But what it does is it opens up the door to folks, global representation, I think, for lack of a better way of putting it. So we're not just looking at just, customers in our area in the town where we're having the workshop or whatever. We're actually opening it up to global representation, which is awesome because we obviously a lot of companies have customers around the world. So
And what are some of those tools that organizations have kind of started to use? Since they have global workforces, and you don't necessarily need to kind of have everyone physically in the room.
yeah, they've. Sorry, the question was they've started using or stopped using.
Started using.
Started using. Yeah, I think there's a lot more of the communication tools and the collaboration tools. I think the collaboration tools are a big thing, right? So things like Mural and Miro and those kinds of tools where people can just log on synchronously or asynchronously and, capture ideas and do these kinds of workshops and things like that. So I'm seeing a lot more usage of these collaboration tools and different communication platforms too. I'll just use Slack for an example. I mean, that was big before, but I think it became even bigger, during the pandemic, and those types of tools where people can just communicate, like I said, synchronously and asynchronously. Communication is key in this remote or hybrid workforce. That's the big thing is communication.
Absolutely. Yeah, cool. Thanks for that, Annette. And just the last one, really, in terms of customer journey mapping, right? What is probably the easiest and the quickest way to do this?
Oh gosh. Fair question, but I would answer it with it's a lot of work, right? I think people do try to take shortcuts and do it themselves, or hey, I can just draw out what the journey is and I don't need to worry about any of that other stuff. You really have to do it right and do it in a detailed fashion so that you have the information, you have the understanding, so you know what's going well and what's not going well. And so I don't know that there's an easy route or a shortcut or anything like that. You just have to put in the work, but again, making sure that you have the foundation so that you're not wasting your time and wasting money doing it. So
Yeah, the only reason I asked that question, and it is obviously, larger organizations are able to kind of set up CX teams and have them dedicated to customer experience, right? But if it was a small, medium enterprise, typically they would want something which is slightly more, quicker, something is slightly more easier to kind of get through. So that's really where that question came from.
okay. Okay, fair enough. My same answer holds because I think the small businesses and the medium-sized businesses need to do the same work because there's really no shortcuts to really taking the time to understand your customers and get it right.
Great. Okay, good stuff. Shifting gears just a little bit then, and then moving into customer centric mindset. Yeah.
Okay.
I think all of us really understand, customer centric mindset is key to customer
Yeah.
experience. But in your, from your experience, how have you seen customer centric mindset play in organizations?
So I'll step back for a second and I'll define what customer centricity is, or how I define a customer centric culture. Right? It's really about bringing that customer voice into everything you do. I would say no discussions, no decisions, no designs without bringing that customer voice in, without asking how is this going to make her feel, what value is going to bring for her, what problems will it solve for her, how is it going to impact the customer, right? So if you think about it in that lens, there's a lot of work that you need to do. And that customer understanding work is a huge part of that because you've got to bring that customer voice in. And so I always start with when we set that mindset, or when we change the culture, it's really culture is core values plus behaviors. And so we have to have the right core values in place, right? And that doesn't mean that every core value has to have the word customer in it. But when you're defining the behaviors associated with your core values, you need to put them into the lens of not only how employees interact with each other, but how they interact with customers. What does it mean? And how do we use that to bring the customer into everything that we do day in and day out? And I love to use the example of customer trust, a client that was having issues with, you know, their entire front line, whether it was sales reps or the contact center, whatever it was, constantly questioning and butting heads with customers. And so we went through this whole exercise, evaluated, their core values and how they've socialized and operationalized those core values, and found that we needed to add something around customer trust. And once we did that, and we again socialized it, operationalized it, defined the behaviors that are acceptable and unacceptable as a result of that, I followed up with the client a couple months later, and she said, "Yeah, it's just easy now. It's just easy now, right? Everybody understands what our values are, what we believe in, and what that means in terms of how we interact with each other and with our customers, and the butting of the heads, pushing back with our customers is no longer an issue."
Yeah, and I think that's key, isn't it? I mean, I think for far too long, organizations have considered, a very transactional approach, right?
Yeah.
And moving them from that transactional approach to really being customer centric, I think is key.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any easy way to get there, and clearly it does take time. But how do we kind of get that started?
Yeah. Well, so in my latest book, Built to Win, I write about the 10 foundational principles of a customer centric culture, a customer centric organization, and it really does start with the culture. It starts, you have to have that foundation in place. So it starts with the culture. You have to define your values and the behaviors, but you've also got to have leadership that's committed to this transformation, to building this customer centric organization, and they've all got to be aligned on it. It can't just be one. It can't just be the CEO, or it can't just be 3 of your 8 executives or anything like that. It has to be. They've got to be aligned on it, because being customer centric is an organization wide thing, an enterprise wide thing, right? And that means that that everybody in the organization has to be a part of the work that needs to be done to transform the organization to being customer centric. If the entire organization isn't involved, when customers go and interact with 5 different departments, they're going to feel like they've just interacted with 5 different companies, because it's going to be 5 different experiences, right? So that's really important. And making sure that the employees have a great experience is foundational as well. I mean, a customer centric organization is one where we could really call it people centric, right? Because you don't have a customer experience without employees. You don't have, who's going to, design, build, sell, service, whatever, your products and your business. Your employees do, right? And so that's what your customers are experiencing, or your customers are feeling. And so employee experience is critical. And then, I'll just add one more thing, is that the customer understanding that we talked about, the journey mapping, the listening to customers, the developing those personas, that is a huge part of, and I call it the cornerstone of a customer centric organization, because if you go back to the definition of bringing the customer voice into all we do, we can't do that without taking the time to do that customer understanding work. And so there's a lot to it. Like you said, it's not just a simple thing to say, hey, we're customer centric and we're done. There's a lot that goes into it. And that transformation usually takes 3 to 5 years, right? So it is a heavy lift.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there any tools that we kind of, use to help develop that culture?
Oh gosh. I'd like to say, if you're talking about technology, I will say no, because not initially, because culture is it's a very much a human thing. But yes, there will be technology and tools that you use for the customer understanding work and some of the other work that you'll bring in to understand the customers. But ultimately, to begin with, the culture and this customer centric mindset is very much a human thing, and it's really more about the people than it is about the tools and technology.
Great, cool. And I think there's a point where organizations kind of get to that stage of really being customer centric. How do you keep it there? Because I think that is really the challenge, isn't it? Because you could have a change in management that happens. A new set of stakeholders come in. How do you maintain that across all of these transitions?
Yeah. So a couple of big things there, right? So hiring for culture fit is huge, right? And it doesn't mean what some people think it means. Some people think it means that you're developing this homogenous, group of people, and it's not. It's really about people who have the same values. And I always say, don't you hang around outside of the office, don't you hang around with people who have the same values as you do. If they don't have the same values as you do, wouldn't that be odd to be hanging out with those people? So that's it. It has nothing to do with creativity or any of those kinds of things. It really has to do with people who are living and breathing those same core values. So hiring for culture fit, mergers and acquisitions, a big thing there is a lot of CEOs are looking at culture when they're making those acquisitions or when they're merging with another organization. I think that's a big thing, is to really focus on the culture. And there's some research out there from Duke University where they found that that is one of the number one things that CEOs look at when they are looking to make an acquisition. So that's huge. When it comes to changes in executives, I think the board has to be involved as well, right? So if there's a new CEO, the board's responsibility is to bring in somebody who is a customer, who's already got that customer centric mindset, right? If you don't, you're totally going to disrupt the apple cart, right? It's going to be really difficult if he or she doesn't believe in a customer centric organization for things to continue the way that they are, and the business will pay for it ultimately. So I think those are three things that you can look at right away.
Great. Okay. Thanks. And obviously, there's the bit around communication as well, right? I mean, that I think is going to be quite critical. What's the best way to communicate with your frontline employees, specifically to do with culture?
So there are a lot of different ways that you can communicate with the organization. So number one, you can develop a culture committee, and that's a cross-functional committee that really brings together cross-functional culture ambassadors, individuals within each department that live and breathe that culture, and their job is to be the conduit between the committee and their departments in terms of communicating back and forth. What are my coworkers, how do they want to ensure that this culture thrives and survives, right? And then they come together and come up with a lot of ideas themselves too that they take back out to the organization. So culture committee is one thing. I think really key is the way that you socialize and operationalize the core values, right? And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. You can have regular training sessions, right? Ongoing. I have a client that does annual core value. It's sort of a refresher, right? Just to remind people of what the core values are, what the acceptable and unacceptable behaviors are, what that means, how we use them, how we live them, that kind of thing. So there's a training. I think, having a monthly or a quarterly, core value of the month, and using that as sort of a route for peer recognition. Hey, my coworker so and so did X, which was really a great representation of core value Y, right? That kind of thing. So those are just some ideas. There's a ton of different ways that we can help to keep those core values alive and living and breathing themselves within the organization.
Yeah, great. I think also while actually onboarding new employees as well, I think that's quite critical, right? That message goes out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And using those core values in the hiring process too. And then definitely when you're, doing orientation and the onboarding and the training that happens there. Absolutely.
Great. And it just in your experience, have you seen any particular organizations have kind of moved, from being a not so customer centric organization to being really on the forefront in terms of, all about the customer and having the customer at the heart of everything that they do?
Yeah. I'll just say I have personal experience with some of them because some of them are my clients, right? And a couple of great examples of, some, I don't want to call them startups, but younger companies, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, where we've gone in and we've done the work and we've really shifted the mindset, starting with the CEO, starting with the leadership teams, and then helped employees realize who the customers are and turn the businesses around. And so I think it's absolutely possible. It's a lot faster moving for smaller and medium-sized businesses. For the larger enterprise, massive organizations, it's a lot more difficult, right? It takes a lot more time, and oftentimes it's business unit by business unit or division. It's those kinds of things where it's got to be a smaller chunk of the business at a time. But when you're working with small, medium businesses, we can see that turnaround a lot quicker. So yeah, absolutely. I've seen it, and it's pretty amazing what it does for the morale of the
Yeah.
employees and
Mhm.
for customers as well. So
Absolutely. Great. Good. And thank you so much. I think some brilliant stuff out there, and some absolute gold nuggets for folks to kind of take back. Well, that's basically it in terms of the questions that I've had. But clearly, just before you go, Annette, is there can you just tell our viewers in terms of where they can find you, all the great work that you do? I mean, you have tons of posts that come on LinkedIn, so if you wouldn't mind.
yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you for having me on again. I really appreciate it. So I'd love to connect with people on LinkedIn. So yeah, you can absolutely find me there. I've also got two websites, cx-journey.com, which is what I'll call my corporate website, where you'll find my blog, and then also AnnetteFranz.com, which is focused on mostly my books and speaking work. So yeah, always happy to connect with folks, and love to talk CX anytime. So
Perfect. And just before you go, can you very quickly tell us a little about your second book, Built to Win, if you wouldn't mind?
for sure. So the second book is called Built to Win. And it really is I write about the 10 foundational principles of a customer centric organization. And the catalyst for the book was sort of twofold. Number one, I kept hearing people talk about being customer centric, and I don't think people really understand what it means to be customer centric. And then the other reason was that I really wanted to inspire leaders to think about it differently and think about what it means to put the customer at the heart of the organization, and how to do that. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. But yeah, the reception has been awesome. People have really appreciated. It is a hot topic right now, so people have really appreciated that.
All right. On that note, and I thank you again
Thank you.
very, very much for being on, and we'll connect with you very soon. Cheers.
Awesome. Thank you.